Hey guys, welcome back to the Landco podcast. We are on episode 4 of our waterfowl development series, and it's been a few months since we've updated this series. So if you're new to us, what we're doing here is my partner and I, Ryan, bought a 140-acre tract in Fulton County with the goal of turning it into a premier waterfowl farm. So what this series is doing is kind of documenting that whole process from start to finish. So, it's probably going to be a 2, 3, 4 year process to get it to where we want it to be. But we thought we would document that to kind of, give value to our current clients that either own land, and it'll give them some ideas what they can do to their farm. People looking for land, it might give them kind of maybe expand their horizons on what they're looking for, especially now the inventory is so bad that maybe it allows them to buy farms that aren't developed because they see potential that maybe other people don't. And it just kind of gives people an idea of what we do in addition to our standard, land brokerage services. So hopping back in, again, it's been a couple months, so there's a lot going on out there. A couple things that I just want to touch on briefly before we get into that design and development. We are looking at putting in power out there, and we're also applying for an Upland preserve license. Not super relevant because we don't have the power could be relevant, but the Upland specifically is not super relevant. We don't have a ton of clients that do that. I just bought an Upland dog, and it's something that my family enjoys, so we're doing it. But the only reason that I bring it up is because it's a very a lengthy process. So I think we applied back in March. It's not an expensive process. I mean, I think the qualifications are maybe you might have to be like a couple hundred acres. And if your farm isn't, you kind of have to get surrounding landowners to be. I might be off on that, but I believe it's around 200 acres. And if you get 200 acres on board, you can sign up for a commercial license, which gives you the right to hunt either 6 months or 12 months a year upland, depending on what license you buy. And I want to say it's only $100 or $200 to buy that license. The real cost comes in that you agree to release to hunt 250 birds, a combination of quail, pheasant, and maybe chukar. I'm not sure on those, but if it's something that you enjoy, it's not a crazy expense, and it allows you to kind of train your dog, go out with your dog, upland hunt all year round. So, but the reason I bring that up, all that's cool, and we can kind of walk you through that more if you're interested. But the reason that I bring that up, if it's something that you want to do, start now. Like everyone, they're kind of understaffed and everything's taking a while. So we applied back in maybe March, and they assigned someone the case, which is usually your local DNR agent. And he was so busy that I don't think he could. I think it was late July, maybe, by the time that he hooked up with us and checked out the farm to make sure that everything qualified. And then we're still kind of waiting for all that stuff to go through. So we're talking a 6-8 month process. So I only say that to if it's something you want to do, start sooner than later. Same goes for power. So at this specific farm, we don't have power. There's power at the road, like the road frontage of the farm, but there's nothing on the interior, at least in the section that we bought. So we don't know exactly what we would do with the power yet. We don't know where we'd put it. We haven't quite designed it yet, but that process takes so long now that we just start immediately. So where we are at, it's Ameren, but most of them are pretty similar. You apply to get a new service, they assign it to somebody, they have to come check it out, measure everything, but that process can take months. And then once they do that, then they have to go back and price it. So we probably started this process, 4 or 5 months ago, and we just got a price a couple weeks ago. So I don't know that we'll do it right away, but now since we have that file in their system, when we're ready to move forward, it's ready to go. So just want to touch on those two things, mainly because if there are things that you have in your long-term plans, start now because they take a while. So getting back into the design and development of this farm, I believe where we left off last time was at the tail end of the construction of our new wetland in the area that we call center field. It's a big ag field. And, go back, I'm not going to go over that again, go back and watch the last few episodes, and it'll kind of document how we designed that and how we built it. But when we left off, we had just planted all the corn, life was good. then, and typically, we'll plant corn with, when we plant all the rest of the corn in the spring, but it's not too uncommon to get flooded out in the spring. We'll plant corn up until like mid-June, maybe even a little later, which usually gets you past all kind of the crazy rains, so you don't have to deal with flooding too much. This year, that was not the case. Like, I think it was early July, maybe late June. There were just some downpours. Like, it rained for like a week, and our new wetland, like, literally filled up. It's tiled, so it typically drains, but there's no laterals. It's just kind of one main tile, and it could not keep up with the water. So that thing filled up. I'll go through some of the pictures we have here. Well, here's the first one. I mean, you can see it is, this was the aftermath of the rain. We lost about half of our corn. So you can replant corn, and you could find really short season corn, like 78 day or 80 day. What we run into here in Illinois, and why we typically stay away from it once you get into July, is you do that math and like, it works. You can say, okay, it takes 90 days to mature, or 80, we're good. We'll flood it once it's done. But what you can run into here is you just run out of growing days. So like, you get into September, early October, and you lose that warmth, cool nights, and it just stops growing. So we get to July and we're looking towards millet or buckwheat, and for the most part, it's a fail-safe. Like, you get into July and there's not a ton of crazy rains, and the millet can kind of withstand that a little better. So looking at these pictures, what we did is we disked and tilled everything that we didn't think was going to produce ears. So here's some pictures here. I mean, you look at all this stuff, like all this area, and this is actually what I'm circling now. For those of you guys listening to this on the podcast, if you're interested enough, like, we put some of this stuff on YouTube, and we have pictures that we kind of walk through. So check that out if you want. But I'm showing some pictures here. This big area we worked up that used to be corn wasn't going to make it. So all that area, there are some low areas throughout the rest of the wetland that we tilled up. On this area in this picture, we put in millet. On the east end that was a little more shallow, we put in buckwheat, and it worked great. I mean, what it does add to our challenges is that, like, with an entire corn wetland, you can kind of cut out your shooting hole, and like, where they're going to land. And blind placement is a little easier. This makes that a little more challenging, but we were like, you know what? Let's just get as much food as we can in there. It's year one of this wetland. Even if we don't hunt it, we're like, let's just let these birds find that. So it will be a little weird. Like, they're going to be able to land in a lot of areas in this wetland, and so we might miss some birds wide or whatever. But we're cool with that. This year, our goal is to have as much food, have the birds find it as much as possible, and we'll worry about the rest of that stuff later. So you can even see some of these pictures here, like, it looks almost like roads. Like, it's narrow enough that literally everywhere where the corn was not going to grow, we tilled up and put into millet and buckwheat, and then cultipacted in. So here's a picture of the aftermath of the buckwheat. This was probably a month ago, but still, you can tell that, like, the buckwheat did great. This one's from just a couple days ago. The millet did great. So we have a ton of food in that wetland. So we're pretty much done. Like, we don't have a blind out there. We'll figure that out, and we'll kind of bring you guys along and let you know where we decide to put it and all that stuff. But for the most part, that wetland's done. We put the gates in the agri-drain just yesterday, and we're just waiting for that thing to fill up. So that one, we're at a standing point. Sunflowers for my next picture, but there's not a ton to talk about. We just, like, Ryan and I everybody loves to duck hunt, but so we put in like 3 or 4 acres of sunflowers. And again, this is strip mine property. It's not the best soil in the world. So our sunflowers they were great for strip mine property, but they're fine. They're not incredible. They did good enough. We shot a bunch of doves out there. Kids got into it. Bring the kids out there. If you haven't dove hunted or grown sunflowers on your farm, it's not a long season. If it gets cold, it could be like, 1 or 2 days even, but those couple days are like some of my favorite days of the year. So if you want to try that, get in touch with us. But that went great. We also briefly touched on what we were, at the time, a couple months ago, anticipating turning into a lake. This area called Clam Lake that we kind of inherited. But when we got it, it wasn't a lake, it was a wetland, but the wetland had been kind of like, I don't know, there was a ton of wetlands on this property, and this one didn't hunt that well, so it just kind of got left alone. And what happens when you leave something alone is it just becomes a mess. So let me try to find a picture of the, here's a good picture. Like, it's a kind of blurry overhead view, but it's not tiled, it sits low, but there's like kind of drainage ditches through it, which is cool, that totally works. But if you don't stay on top of those, Phragmite can just kind of like, just take over those areas. So literally of this wetland, I'll kind of outline those. All this stuff, like in this whole area up here, all that stuff was like, you know, you couldn't walk through it, you couldn't plant it. So it just became kind of a pain to plant around it. They killed some birds down there, but not a lot. So what we decided to do, again, so let me take one step back. I think the last time we had this conversation a couple months ago, we had planned on turning this into a lake. This whole area here, we were going to raise it 6 or 8 feet and turn it into a big lake. We were working with the neighbor on that, and he was going to raise his lake, you know, 4 or 8 feet, which was going to allow us to raise ours. He has since decided not to do that, at least for the time being. So we're not comfortable with the depth. You know, we like to have, I think the general rule of thumb is like you want 10%, let me see that back. You want 10 feet or greater in 20% of your lake. We probably err on the side of like having a little more depth. So we like to say 12 feet or more on 20% of the lake. And we weren't going to get there with the way this was designed. So we still may turn this into a lake down the road, especially if the neighbor decides to raise his. But for the time being, we're taking a step back from that idea, which isn't the end of the world. Like, our goal here is to make this a waterfowl farm, you know, a duck hunting farm. So if we don't have a fishing lake here, not the end of the world. So our plan now is to get in there, clean up all that Phragmite, and try to level out as much of that as we can, clean those ditches up so we can maintain them, and turn it back into the wetland that it probably was when it was designed. So some of these pictures, like you can see, here's us mowing this Phragmite down. It was thick and it was nasty. You couldn't walk through it, can't obviously plant through it. So the first thing we did was cut all that down. Like, here's an old duck blind that we used to hunt out of, and you can see like it's probably been years since you could hunt this area because all the stuff was, you know, 10-foot tall Phragmite. So we cut all that stuff down. Oh, that's kind of a bad picture. This is one of the drainage ditches. Some more of that Phragmite. But here's a good picture of what happens when you have those drainage ditches and don't maintain them and kind of let the Phragmite get out of control, is you can't access them anymore. And it's not, you know, we're not talking about tile that's below grade that flows water. This is just a natural ditch. And, you know, it was shaped at some point with an excavator or something, but what happens if you don't maintain that is like this whole area is like, I'm trying to explain it for people who aren't watching this and don't see this picture, but a lot of that sediment will come down and it'll like block off part of that drainage ditch, so it won't allow it to drain properly. So this area, like, that needs cleaned out so this stuff can keep draining down. So the plan there, at least for this year going into next year, because we're too late to plant stuff this year, so we just want to make sure we're prepared for next year, is we're getting rid of all the Phragmite. We are leveling off the areas that don't need ditches so we can plant through them. Like here, this picture right here, this area used to be a ditch with Phragmite. We don't think we need it, so that area we got rid of all that stuff, brought in some dirt and just leveled it out so we can plant through it. That is not going to be the case for all of it. It just needs to drain water. We did find a spring like in the middle of September, it was still draining water. So we cleaned up the ditches that we think we're going to need to keep. So like, here's a great picture. Like this, all this mud out here was stuff that we got rid of. We cleaned it from these banks, and we'll let it sit there until it dries out, and we'll go in and, in a week or two and we'll smooth it out. But at least we have these nice clean drainage ditches that we could plant right up next to, and we could spray them and just make sure that we're keeping them under control. So that is the plan there. Here's kind of a bird's eye view of that wetland. We weren't entirely done yet when this picture was taken, but it gives you an idea. Like, it's a huge, let me try to go back to that overhead picture. It's a big area. So this, not these blue lines, but it's a little lower. But this area, I mean, we're talking, it's probably bigger than the center field wetland. It might be 6 or 8 acres maybe. And before, you could probably only plant 2 or 3 of that. Moving into next year, we think we'll be able to plant like nearly all of it, minus a few ditches. So that's our plan there. Again, we're doing work now because we're going to fill it this year just to kind of get the birds used to the water, but there's going to be no food in there this year. So we're not expecting to hunt it. We're just filling it up to have water there to get the birds, keep them used to it. But more than anything, we want to have this work done now. So after the season, say January, February, whatever it is, we can drain that and give it time to dry. So come April, it's dry as a bone, and we could plant through it without having to try to fight, getting any work done early spring. So it can be nice to work on this stuff, in the fall before. It's kind of weird that you're giving up a season if you don't have other wetlands, but come next spring, this one's going to be ready to roll. So that one is done, well, at least done to the point where we can get it this year. So that one's ready to roll. Let me scroll through some of these pictures here. That was the last one. So the next project that we had, I may have touched on the idea that we're going to do something with it last episode, but we hadn't started anything. But if you look at, let me find a aerial view here. So this would be we're looking at the northwest side of our farm, and we're making another new wetland, not because we think like we need a ton more food out here, but the wetland was like, it was already almost completed. A lot of times we look at like opportunities on a farm and kind of run through like, what's the cost value there? Like, how much is it going to cost us, and is it going to be, how cool is it going to be? And this wetland that I'm about to talk about, it's not going to be huge. I can't imagine that we'll hunt it as much as we hunt the other stuff, but the cost to put it in was like, it was very low because it was almost already a wetland. Like, there was a drainage ditch going through there that was tiled already. So it's a flat bottom. There was a levee in place, like a dry dam. A lot of times if you're looking for these places that might not be expensive to build, like, go look at your tillable fields. If it's been levied at all, if anyone's put in dry dams to kind of slow erosion, it's a good spot to start because you could almost use those as your levee for a wetland. A lot of the times they're not huge because, they're not trying to, when farmers put those in, they're not trying to impound like a bunch of water. They're trying to slow water down, but they can double for wetlands. They're just not huge, but the cost to do them, to convert them to wetlands is very low. So this was one of those cases. So like looking at this picture, so we're looking south at this low area right here, when we shot this, I'll show you that picture, was done. Like, all we had to do was put in an agri-drain here, and this would hold water. All this water from this top field drains down there, and it's tiled right through the middle. So it was an easy spot to do it, so we just went ahead and did it. And we did decide to make it a little bigger because it was pretty small. And so let me run through some of these pictures. Here's this area. So this was the drain. It's tiled right through the middle. The problem was, well, actually this one did have an agri-drain in it from way back in the day. You can kind of see the top of it, but someone had like ran over it with the bat wing, so it was worthless. So what we did was just dug a hole here and put in a new box, tied to the agri-drain, and we're home free. Like, even if that's all we did, it'd be a pretty cool wetland. We'd hunt it a few times a year. But it wasn't the biggest. Like, I want to say it was only like, here's a perfect picture of it. It was only like maybe an acre, which, that's cool. It's a good enough wetland if that's all you have. But this particular case, it was pretty efficient to make it bigger on the east. So here's what we looked at, and here's what we kind of landed on. This mowed spot, it's not exactly the waterland, but it's pretty close to what their water line would be. It's something like that. And there's our box down here. Kind of the tile goes here. So that's cool. It was about like an acre, like I said. But this whole area over here was like the slope of that, the grade of that incline was so gradual that we decided to spend a few days pushing this dirt out. I'm going to redraw that because it's awful. We decided to push this dirt out into this area. There's some low spots, some trees. We accomplished two things there. We kind of filled in these low holes next to it, and it also allowed us to get more water for the wetland. So this yellow area, let's show some pictures, is now under water grade. So that the whole thing is these two combined. So the thought process here, let me back out of that, is that we mowed all the stuff here and we're converting it into tillable. So we'll plant corn here, and we're going to plant all the way through, all the way into the wetland. So all this stuff will be corn, through here, and then we'll harvest. The plan is now, this could change, but the plan now is to harvest all this stuff. So we'll literally have corn stubble going down the hill into the wetland. We can maybe hide a blind here or something and have our shooting hole in here, which would be corn stubble that rolls up into an ag field. What a confusing drawing, but if you're listening and looking at the picture, it'll make sense. So that's what we did, and it's done already. I mean, here's a picture of us mowing everything out there and kind of shooting elevation to see how much dirt we need to remove. We had to pluck some trees out. I say trees, they were small trees. We got them with the Bobcat. Here is the new agri-drain that we put in. And again, these agri-drains, we talk about them a lot, but essentially this is a gate valve. This thing ties down to the tile, which goes, is subgrade. But we have a box here that attaches to another pipe, and there's just gates. So if you have the gates up, the water goes straight through. If you put the gates in, undo that, it goes into the valve, over the gates, and out. So your water level is wherever that gate is. So you can fill it all the way really to the top of that agri-drain box. So there's the agri-drain, there's the box, and here's where we started getting into moving dirt around. The pictures aren't going to show it perfectly, but here was the existing water line, and essentially he's just pushing dirt back, so that is all underwater as well. I say that was a water line. This area was like I think 2 feet underground. So he's pushing this area back, so that will also be water when we fill it. There's another angle of it. Here is the finished product. So all of this area over here, this new area that we kind of excavated out. So here is the slope that we were left with. So this area out here will be the cornfield, and so we can plant all the way through right down to the wetland and pick that and have kind of our shooting hole can be here, kind of with corn stubble. So it should be a pretty cool project. So that is done. So we're kind of at a standstill, which is cool. It's welcome, like a welcome change. We're getting into hunting season. We're almost into early October here. Now we're just kind of waiting for these to fill up, and we got as much done as we could on the 3 wetlands that we have going. And so once we get into after the season, we'll be ready to go for next year. And while I'm excited about this year, just because we love to shoot ducks, I think next year we'll start to show the potential of this farm, and then it should only get better. So that's it. We got 3 wetlands rolling into this year with a couple more planned. Well, at least one more planned. They're kind of spaced out evenly throughout the property, so the design went well. Moving forward, the issues we'll have to deal with, and they're not issues this year, but we may put up a building there. We're talking about putting power to, well, 1, if the building, but 2, to maybe get some electric pumps out there so pumping water is easy. Pumping can be a pain if you don't have access to electric pumps, but we may choose just to stick with the gas pumps, but that's going to be an issue to see how we get water to all these wetlands. Luckily for us, we're all friends with the neighbors and there's plenty of water out there and we can pump from their lakes and stuff, but it's always nice to have a farm kind of standalone, work efficiently by itself. So we will be looking to figure out how to accomplish that. We'll be probably building another wetland, and then we'll probably regroup and readdress the clam lake in the next couple of years to see if we want to turn that into a lake or keep it a wetland. But a lot of that stuff we'll kind of like, see how it goes over the next few years before we make that decision. But that's it for this episode. As soon as we have some more developments, we'll add it to this series and release another episode. So stay tuned, and we'll come at you with more info as soon as we have it. But we appreciate you guys listening, and we'll be back shortly.